How's it going? My name's Aaron. I'm a software developer at Best Buy. So we use React every day, mostly, when I'm not writing, legacy backbone. So yeah, there's my email address up there. If you'd like to get in contact with me at all after this talk, we're hiring developers, as you can imagine, because it's software. So if you know anyone or you'd like to hear about Best Buy, feel free to come up to me. So yeah, the topic of this talk is React IoC. And IoC is an acronym for Inversion of Control. I don't know, just to show of hands, like if you have thought about inversion of control or you have heard of it or use it on a regular basis. All right, cool. So we're gonna kind of describe, how this might apply to React. And I will just preface this by saying that I try to think in design patterns on a daily basis, but I don't consider myself I don't know, I don't have a traditional CS background, and I didn't really learn most object-oriented design stuff in any formal way. It's more like I just talk to people and they just tell me like, hey, you should try this pattern. I'm like, okay, well, that seems cool. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do now, is just to give some insight. Hopefully it's beneficial to you, in the next design session you have. But inversion of control basically means that something could specify its dependencies at runtime rather than compile time. And kind of the benefit to this, especially in the JavaScript world, is that creating modularized components that can sort of stand by themselves and then be extended by other components is a really favorable architecture. So, and that's really like most of the goals of inversion of control. We want modular components, things that I can sort of like mix and match. You want extensibility, so it's makes something should be very easy to extend. Reuse, so allowing extensibility and reuse kind of play into each other, and decoupling. So if you're building something, you want to design towards implementations, not concrete implementations, but abstractions from those implementations. So, and if I sound like a broken record, I'm actually just reiterating the principles of solid design patterns, which raise your hand if you think about solid on a daily basis. No? So basically solid is, I recommend checking it out. It's a set of design principles about object-oriented design. Some examples like the S stands for single responsibility principle. So the idea is that you'd have one thing that has just as one thing. It's not trying to reinvent the entire application. But one thing can be really good at one thing. O stands for open close principle. So it's open for modifications and open for extension and closed for modification. So sort of like, here's your black box. I give you ways to plug into my box, and you can go about plugging into it, but my box is my box, and I make sure that everything in my box is good. So we'll get into more concrete examples of this. I really don't have many slides, but that gets me to the how, which, by the way, I missed the last 3 of the solid principles because I don't really have them memorized or anything. Those are just kind of examples. But so one example I'm going to walk through is a pattern called the Decorator Pattern, which actually I couldn't ask for a more perfect segue from Sarah's talk, because I'm not going to be talking specifically about ES7 decorators, but Decorator Pattern basically states that it allows some behavior to be given to instances of a class without affecting everything else that's happening with that class. So the static pieces of that class are untouched, and then other instances are untouched by the behavior that I'm passing to these instances. So it's a lot of words, so let's just look at some examples. I think I'm gonna copy this into a code editor, if that's all right, so I can add them. Ooh, nice. We can be friends. That's cool. All right. Oops. Yeah, definitely. Trying to get Trying to click on this box down here, but when I mouse over, it's, so let's make, there we go. Oh, okay. JavaScript. Yeah, let's go with that one. All right. So yeah, I'm just going to walk through a couple examples. These are kind of things that I've found after just the last month of things that I've been working on. This is a pretty simple example, but has anyone used Redux? I figure anyone in the React world has probably touched it before, but so React Redux provides a function, and it's a perfect segue as well, higher order components. So really what React Redux is doing when you call the connect function is it's returning a new class that sort of wraps the functionality of your class. And you can think of that class as it's decorating the functionality of instances of that class. So here's kind of a simple example. Basically, we have something called a validator. And we have a couple things. We have an email validator. So this is sort of like a concrete implementation of a validator. It has a validate method. Just takes some input, makes sure it's an email. And then it also has a create error message. So if you wanted to specify, this validator says, you know, your input is not a valid email, versus another input might say, or another type of validation might say, this input is not a valid number, something like that. So really, it's just an object that has a couple methods on it. We have a function for checking if it is a validator, just checking that the validate function is there. And this is our this is sort of our implementation of creating a validated component. So the idea is that you would pass in. So let's say I have a component like you know some component that wraps an input element, and that component accepts a property called onChange, and I'm going to create some higher order component that sort of like abstracts away the validation logic and how you'd handle showing error messages, how you'd keep track of state of whether or not the input is valid or not. So the idea here is that this is a function, and it accepts two arguments, validator and a component. And so a component might be my, you know, if I had something like, you know, class, my input, and that was a React component, that'd be the thing that you're passing in as the second argument. First argument is just any validator object. We will just check if it's a validator. And then really the meat of it is that we're going to return a new class. And we can really call this anything we want. In this case, I called it validated component. That way, you know, if you're using like the React dev tools in Chrome, you can still get some sort of name to your component. Because really, we're going to create a component that wraps the thing that you're passing in. So how you might go about this, there are things that I put in here as sort of an example of what you might do, but really the meat of it is that at the end of the day, your render function is going to return an instance of the component that you passed in, and we're just going to pass in the same props and the state of this component, and you know, kind of the benefit of that is that let's say I create a new component called email validated component equals create validated component. And I pass in my email validator and some other component. What we can do with this is that whenever you create an element based on this component, any properties you pass in here, like you know, name, those are just going to be passed in, and sort of like this component just delegates and says, all right, you gave me some props, I'm just going to throw those into the original component that you passed in. So so that's really the meat of it, is that at the end of the day, we're passing in the same state and props. Well, really the more important thing is the props of the component that you're passing in. But the nice thing is that since we're the ones rendering that component, you can sort of intercept that and say, well, I want to add some additional functionality because you've said that you want a validated component, so I'm going to pass in some functionality that this component wraps. So that's kind of the rest of what this does, is that This validated component keeps track of its own state and it says, do I have an error message? Am I valid? And it abstracts away the difficulty of saying, okay, I have a validator, and I'm going to call validate on this input. And actually this function here gets passed in as a property to the component that we're sort of wrapping, decorating. So that's one example. It kind of follows the model of the connect function in React Redux. And if you've ever been curious about how that might be implemented, that's one example. Any questions on that before I go to example number 2? Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about if you have both props and state going into that component? If that's a problem, like, is there conflicts, naming conflicts?
Yeah, true. Yeah. So that's a good point, because in this case right here, so I'm sorry, what was your name? Jim. So to Jim's point, if I had, let's back this up here, and I had some class called input and let's say that responded to a property called error message. Let's say it does something with this.props.error message. The point he's bringing up is that this component has, this validated component is passing its state as properties to the component that it's wrapping. So it's got these two keys, error message and is valid. And so it's possible that you would have naming conflicts where, when you used this component, since this component responds to this.props.error message, you might have said error message equals blah. But I guess I actually don't know what would happen. But to your point, it can you can run into some strange things. I guess, I don't know if anyone knows like what happens when multiple keys get passed in, or the same key gets passed in, but maybe it throws an error. Overrides. So maybe in the order of precedence of keys. So that's definitely something to look out for. I think that's why you'd probably want to name the special properties that you're delegating to this component pretty explicitly. But that's a really good point. And actually, we'll kind of see that in my second example, probably a lot more. Yeah, good question. Anyone else? Cool. So I just have one more example. Something I was implementing at work, I kind of went down the React Redux Connect higher order components route, and I backed out for certain reasons. Mostly it became an issue of I wanted to be able to pass in properties at runtime, which this sort of delegation is sort of like an upfront delegation, at least in the first example. Whereas the second example I have is a little more flexible, I'd say. But I'm curious what you guys think of it, because I don't know, I came up with it in a box, so I don't know if anyone else is doing this or not, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. But basically the idea here is that, let's say we have, here's our implementation of what we're going to extend with functionality. So it's a really simple component. It's just a function. It takes properties and it renders out a button. And it happens to also want to do something when you click that button. But the thing is that the button is just a button. We don't want the button to be responsible for what happens when you click the button, because when I put this button on a different page and I want to be able to pass in different functionality, I mean, you guys are probably very familiar with this, passing in functionality via props. But all I'm doing right here is I call this function create click handler. And basically there's a prop actually hidden in this guy. The props get passed into this function. It returns an event handler, which is just a function that takes an event. So that I can call prevent default, but then it actually just delegates to a property that you pass in called cart callback. So a cart button can be used like this. And I would just say cart callback. And let's say I had a reference to a function, like maybe I was in another class and I would say this dot handle cart add, something like that. So that might be my usage of the button. So that way I can say, okay, well, I'm gonna make sure that this cart button is really only responsible for its presentation. And that way I can just pass in any functionality that I want to happen. So kind of the thing that I started working with is that I created what I call a connection class. And basically the idea here is that I want to create a class that encapsulates the functionality of what happens when you click the button. And that way, sort of like the dependencies of that button are not intertwined with actually the button class itself. So in this example, we've got a function called add to cart. And you can assume that this is a black box. You pass in an object that represents, some SKU, some TV on the website. And it goes and does a bunch of magic. It calls like 10 different components and like 100 APIs to go add the SKU to the cart. So it's a big black box of mystery. But basically, we want to be able to wrap that functionality and delegate it to this component. So we've also got something called action props. So you can think of like actions that the cart button might take. And these are specifically the properties that we're going to delegate into the component. So in this case, we've got a cart callback, which is what we defined up above. So this guy right here. So it accepts as a property called a function called cart callback, and it just passes its own SKU. So and here's sort of the meat of it. You've got this function. It's a React component called connection. And essentially what it does is it wraps, and it uses the React children API. And it says, okay, you pass me one child, and I'm going to wrap the functionality of that child, and I'm actually going to inject some additional functionality by passing in props to it. So just to look at maybe how it's used before we explain it, you can think of it like this connection. It just has one child called cart button, and it wraps functionality in for that cart button. So kind of how that's done is, so we've got a reference to the child element. And if you haven't checked out, there's a small part of the React API, which is already relatively small, but small part called React.children lets you make assertions, or not assertions, but call functions on the children property. So we pass it in this.props.children. We're calling the only function. And really that's the only reason for that is I haven't really designed this to be able to pass in multiple children. So this basically asserts that, all right, you passed in one child, which funny enough, like this function actually throws an error if there's more than one child. So might not be something that you want to use for any production purposes, which is what I'm going to do on Monday. But so then basically we're going to ask that child element, okay, what props have you already been passed? And we're going to take that props object and then just put some more stuff on it. So the way I did that was that it's really this object.assign here, which is like a merge. And so it takes the original props of the object, merges it over, so it's right to left. So it takes original props, merges it over action props, which is this object I defined up here, and then merges it over an empty object just to get a brand new object reference back. So, and basically what we do is we take that, we've got a new set of properties as an object, and we're just going to call react.cloneElement, and that basically you pass it an element that is already created and additional new properties, and it will render or return a new component. Sorry, I'm getting component and element mixed up, but return a new element with those properties. So this is how we've sort of like injected some piece of functionality into the component that is a child of this component. So, and then we just return the clone child. So actually at the end of the day, we're not creating any additional elements or anything. We're just saying, okay, we're gonna just wrap one child element with some additional functionality. So that's pretty much the gist of this example. Does anyone have any questions on that or further clarification?
Where's action props defined?
Oh, sorry, that's up here. Just an object that has, so this is sort of like, you can imagine that this connection would be in its own file. And so I've just defined an object here to pass in additional props. Yeah, it's just a function, takes a skew, calls the black box of add to cart madness that some other team made, and it's like 10,000 lines long, and I just want you to add this skew to the cart. So yeah.
So assuming you're exporting generic connection functionality, what's your strategy in direction?
I'm sorry, so you said handling indirection?
Yeah, right. It's got so much generic functionality and it's a really cool pattern. I really like the way you're using it. But as I'm thinking about like how I would use it, I'm thinking about as more and more people are using this and spreading it around, and maybe not having to say, I have these activities, how do I protect it?
Yeah, definitely. So one part of this is that my implementation of this connection in a real app was that it sort of responds to different component types that you pass in. So let's say you render it with a cart button. It does a check and actually says, is this a cart button component? If so, I'm going to pass in these properties. So that was one way that I've gotten around it so far. So I've kind of like extended this functionality to say, did you pass me a cart button? If so, I'm going to pass you this callback. But if you passed me like a price block or something that also has cart functionality but is defined in a different way, then it can respond to that in a slightly different way then. So unfortunately, that side of it does kind of couple this component to concrete implementations, but we don't really have interfaces in JavaScript, so it's hard. But yeah, sorry, were you going to say something? Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Looked into render callbacks. Maybe the card callback, just you were passing it as a prop, but there's also the ability to have render callbacks. So say you have an error, an on-click, or whatever, you could then return an appropriate component from that, and that would be in your children. So his children can take an object that has multiple functions. So it would accomplish kind of what you're trying to do. Okay. But you would also additionally be able to have potentially as many callbacks or as few callbacks as you wanted, and pass them in as children. And so you might be less locked into the concrete implementation.
Oh, okay.
Because you could pass in a function that you get from anywhere.
Yeah.
So add to cart or add to gift list or whatever.
Yeah.
It just might be a pattern that you might look into.
Yeah, definitely.
Similar. I don't know looking at this off the top of my head, but when you said cart callback, it just seemed like render callbacks was something that might look at.
Cool. Yeah, I've actually never heard of that. Yeah. Is it like when you say render callback, it's like what does that mean exactly?
So yeah, in your render function, inside of one of the components, say your outermost component, you could have you would pass in as a child, as your child, instead of passing in a component as the child, you can actually pass in just a JavaScript object. So this children would be a JavaScript object with multiple properties, which you could define whatever.
That's sweet. Yeah. I'm definitely going to do that. Yeah. Yeah.
I will warn you, it actually people frown down upon it.
Okay.
It seems like a very React kind of way of doing things.
Yeah.
And the guy who does React Router actually was the one who suggested it. So hopefully it's not too far.
Yeah, no, it's really cool. So like if I had, so just the syntax for that, like if it was connection and I would just say, give me an object like that.
Yes, and then inside of there, you could have multiple keys on that object. So you could have like error, because potentially you're getting, on cart add a function, and then you can return
Ah,
So then the components start to have access to that from the outside.
yeah.
You can actually have multiple, this could be infinitely deep, right? Because
Yeah.
they all have children.
Yeah.
So you start to develop that chain of components.
Cool.
I don't know if it'll work exactly for your case, but
Yeah.
interesting.
No, definitely. Yeah, I didn't know that was a feature. Cool. Anything else? Cool. I think that does it. If you guys have any questions or concerns or know more about object-oriented programming than me, or don't, I'd love to hear it. So.